I think it's stating the obvious if I say that we're actually living through historical times, and times when we will look back and reminisce, with hopefully in a positive way. But what is, I think, amply clear is that none of us has really encountered times like this in our lives. I can say certainly for myself. Maybe earlier wars, etc., which thankfully I have not had the the reason to be part of yet, actually, or living through such times. But this is a warlike situation in some sense, but with important differences. And what I'll do is, before I actually comment on the ideas behind the package, behind not just the package but the vision that's been laid out for the economy by the Honorable Prime Minister yesterday. Before I get into that, what I'll try and do is to give you a sense of what can we expect. I think everything that I say or anybody else says, any analyst, I would strongly recommend participants to to continually recalibrate, because if there's anybody who basically says that he or she can speak with confidence about what will happen in the next 11 10 to 12 months, either he is a charlatan or an astrologer of infinite capacity. I think rest of us, all humans, will have to basically be humble enough to admit that that we have to continually recalibrate. Now, one thing that I do want to actually highlight, though, is that while we make judgments, we also must be aware of some of the human frailties that all of us are subjected to. And I speak based on my understanding of behavioral economics here. One of the biases which affects our decision making significantly, all humans, is what is called the saliency bias. And it seems like a very scary term, but it's very simple to understand, which is that when we are going through normal times, we keep thinking that those normal times will continue, and we really put very low weight on the probability of, or a chance of a black swan event. Now, the same thing happens once we are actually going through a black swan event. Then we overweight the chances of us continuing in that black swan event, and basically discount the possibility of going back to normal times. This is covered very, very well in a book that I highly recommend all of you to read, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, by the person who won the Nobel Prize for his research in behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman. He highlights this, and that's something which all of us must be wary about. That this is a human frailty, human bias that we all are subjected to. So, it's quite possible that all of us may be making judgments which are affected by this bias, and therefore we may possibly be more pessimistic than we need to be if you were making perfectly rational assessments. I say this based on the research that has been done for the Spanish flu episode of 1918, 1919, which happened 100 years back. Now, research, the advantage of that is basically it's evidence. And by the way, if some of you have questions, we can engage. Some of you might wonder what's the relevance of something that happened 100 years back to now. Legitimate question, but actually, rather than getting sidetracked by that, let me just tell you that it is extremely relevant. For one, it is the pandemic that is comparable in order to what COVID, what we are encountering with COVID. None of the other pandemics come even close. And here I think it's useful to just give you some statistics. The R naught parameter, which basically captures the number of people who are likely to be infected by an infected person, is about 2.2 to 2.3 for the Spanish flu, and about 2.4 for COVID. Just to contrast, how other episodes cannot be really employed as a good proxy, for rational assessment of what might happen in the future. The common influenza that comes every year has an R naught of about 1.2, while the smallpox or Ebola have R naughts in excess of 3.5. So the COVID, from a pandemic point of view, is actually the closest proxy. In terms of the devastation that the pandemic caused, 1/3 of the global population was infected by the Spanish flu. Just to give you a comparison, less than 1% of the population today is affected by COVID. So even if you allow for the fact that in the 100 years that have passed since then, population has, let's say, increased about 2.5, 3 times. Even then, the number of people that is infected is actually an order of magnitude lower than what it was during the Spanish flu. That's point number one, to basically capture the devastation. Point number two is that the mortality rates among the people who were infected, the mortality rates were 10% for about 10% for the Spanish flu. Global average for COVID is about 3.4%. So, which means the mortality rate is about 1/3. And in India in particular, our recovery rates are higher and our mortality rates are also lower than the global averages. So which is also something that we must keep in mind. Now, the reason I actually am comparing to a pandemic that was actually of a similar order but was far more devastating is that even with such devastation, the economic impact, economic output was a V-shaped recovery, which means that if you think about it, basically there's a decline in output and then it goes up. Now, if you put together what I've said is the fact that quite likely all of us are affected by this human frailty of saliency bias, which is overweighting recent experiences, especially those that are more fearful, for instance, and the fact that the only rational piece of evidence that we can gather is from the Spanish flu, which generated a V-shaped recovery despite it being far more devastating pandemic, then I think it's a reasonable judgment to make, with all the uncertainty that we should have a V-shaped recovery even in India. And I acknowledge that among all the economists, I have been the only person who's actually gone on almost on one leg, actually claiming this based on the research. And I will make the I think I do not want to be infected by certainly not by corona, but I don't want to be infected by SARS. And that's one of the reasons why I actually have. So India, it's quite likely that we will have a V-shaped recovery. Yes, things, the way things stand now, they do look very bad. But just imagine how things would have looked, during the Spanish flu, with 1/3 of the population infected and 10% rates. People would have been far, far more scared, and yet it actually generated a V-shaped recovery. So this is something that I just want to, to put across to you. Many of you may not agree with me, and that's fine. This is a situation where all of us have to employ each one's judgment. I would rather actually use judgment that is devoid of some of the biases that I am worried about. So that said, now so if there is going to be a V-shaped recovery, in the short run, or till that recovery happens, what is the key impact? And Harsh alluded to this. So if you go back to first principles, and by the way, for those of you, because this is the AIMA, the management graduates, I think, and management professionals should always employ, look to employ thinking from first principles, because while you may encounter completely new situations, but thinking from first principles always, I think, leads to far more rigorous thinking, and and possibly therefore better better assessments and better decisions. So that's something I strongly encourage, and I myself employ a lot. So if from first principles in economics, what we really always use is supply and demand. Now if you take a war, and COVID is a war-like situation, but not exactly a war. What are the key differences? Let's understand that. When you have a war, because people are worried about there's uncertainty in a war, people will not basically go and go on for basically tourist places. People will not indulge that much in discretionary spending. So services usually gets impacted. Essential consumption holds the economy together. Discretionary spending goes down significantly. That's what happens in a war-like episode. I think something similar is happening and will happen in the case of the COVID as well. There's an important difference that in a war, what happens is, because of the bombing, etc., that happens, many factories basically just get reduced to ashes, become rubble, and so that generates important supply side disruptions. Now, this is a crucial difference in the case of COVID, that there is no factory that has basically gotten destroyed, or which is where infrastructure is lost. So that part of, in other words, capital, which basically just completely destroyed and has to be set up, physical factories, equipment that gets destroyed, and it takes its time for it to for it to be rebuilt. That, and the time that it takes, actually, therefore there are likely to be a lot of supply side constraints. That is not something that is happening or will happen in the case of a pandemic. So that's an important distinction. Now, does that mean that there will be no supply side impact? No, I'm not, that's not what I'm saying. There will be some supply side impact, but that supply side impact will come from demand side effects. What do I mean by that? Which is, if you have demand going down like it has during the lockdown period, then because of lower demand, companies may not be able to accumulate as much revenues. They may not be able to sell as much, but they, a lot of their fixed costs can are likely to be to basically be borne even during these periods. And variable costs also, while they may be able to decline, or they may be able to proportionally reduce their variable costs, they may not be able to reduce it significantly. May be able to I think maybe reduce it by 50-60% depending upon the sector. So you have a situation where fixed costs continue to be what they are, variable costs are much are lower, but maybe not completely lower. As a result, basically the firm gets into liquidity issues, and these liquidity problems, which is temporary problems about cash flows, etc., that may create also that may create problems on solvency for firms. Now, it's very important to distinguish this supply side impact into two broad categories. And this is important because for any economy, money does not grow on trees, and therefore when you direct spending, you actually have to direct it where the bang for the buck is higher. So there are those firms which basically before the COVID itself were in a very poor shape. In other words, they basically had some problem with their businesses. They maybe, take for instance some sectors, like for instance, take the automobile sector, which is experiencing a possibly an important shift in demand towards more renewables, etc. So it's likely that we are in a phase where automobile sector is maybe is a more sunset sector. So there may be other sectors as well. Now if there are sectors that are going to be fundamentally not viable because their demand is going to suffer a permanent shock, then one has to actually think about such firms, whether it actually is good bang for the buck, because you don't want to be putting good money after bad. And that's what works. That's important to understand in a market economy, that resources have to get reallocated to those sectors where the bang for the buck is higher. Contrast, for instance, let's say some sunrise sectors versus sunset sectors. That's an important. In other words, sectors and firms that are likely to be which were, let's say, less viable even before the crisis, COVID crisis, they are ones that we have to think about. But there are firms which actually, and sectors which were viable, very much viable, but then the COVID actually is creating difficulties for them. Those firms need to be supported definitely, and it's that's where it's really critical to sort of support for some firms. It's and that's really critical. In this, you also have to keep in mind that that destruction and creative destruction in a market economy, unfortunately, is something which is required to some extent, because inefficient firms have to actually basically die. They do create some difficulties in the short run, but they have to die, and workers have to get reallocated, possibly retrained, and go into sectors where they actually are they're going to be more productive. So this is an important aspect that we must keep in mind. Now let me talk about the in this context, what is the vision that that we are basically trying to articulate for the new India. First, I think this episode has clearly shown, and the Prime Minister highlighted it as well, is that we need to have domestic capabilities, especially in some of the strategic sectors. It could be health, it actually is defense, telecom, for instance. Maybe some sectors we need to have strategically important sectors, we need to have domestic capabilities, and that's what basically Atmanirbhar Bharat really means. Atmanirbhar Bharat does not mean closing our doors, because when we close our doors, what happens is we basically stop competition, and when you stop competition, complacency gets enhanced, and that basically reduces the competitiveness of firms. So that is not what Atmanirbhar Bharat actually means. It's comes from self-confidence, and that which itself comes from capabilities. An important aspect of the Atmanirbhar Bharat, and something that the PM touched upon as well, which is demand. If you take some of the large economies, the United States, China, for instance, and India, because we have such a large population, our firms can actually produce for catering to the demand, in India. Now, one of the aspects that, if you see, a lot of our firms have tried to focus more on products and services that are deliverable to, let's say, the top 20-30% of the population in terms of the demography. But I'll take an example from the FMCG sector, for instance. About 20 years back, if you looked at shampoos or hair oils, etc., which basically the poor also wanted to use, they would not be able to afford it, because their cash flow cycles were very different. They basically would work for a week, get cash. So if they could afford, basically, when these were made available in sachets, for instance, shampoo sachets or hair oil sachets, now it's the same product which they also wanted to consume, but because it was packaged and made into a small sachet, the price point was much lower, and so the same product basically the poor also could afford. This is an example of actually manufacturing for the bottom of the pyramid, which is something that, given the large economy, large consumer base that we have, unfortunately our corporations, actually India Inc. has not exploited enough. In FMCG sector actually stands out as an exception, and to some extent now, if you look at how affordable housing, there's something of that is happening. But across the board, if you look at, and maybe a nano was an attempt actually along that direction, but there is far more. The opportunity in this is just significant, and our companies need to actually think creatively how they can take the same product or service and maybe tweak either the price point or the offering itself a little bit, so that they actually can go and utilize it. One more example I'd give you is the prepaid, for instance, prepaid mobile versus the postpaid. If you look at research in consumer behavior, typically the poorer folks actually use a lot more prepaid connections than the postpaid connections, and that's because prepaid, actually you have a commitment. You, let's say, take you're recharging for $100, then you'll spend it more judiciously, because if it's a postpaid, then you may not spend it as judiciously. So these are examples of products and services that can be tailored and actually made for the Indian economy, and thereby take the vision of basically local that can be made global, which is what the PM has talked about. Because if these products and services are appealing to a large part of the bottom section, of the bottom of the pyramid, then they basically clear the threshold that is required for the for that product or service to basically be economically viable, and then that strengthens that brand or the product, and which can then be exported as well. So this is something which, for all companies and all management graduates and management professionals, I want to leave this as an idea that Atmanirbhar Bharat also means being able to come up with products and services that can be tailored to these. One final example is microfinance, for instance, of financial services being taken to the to basically to the poorer. So this proposition that products and services can only be delivered in a profitable way by private enterprise only if it is catered to the top 20-30% of the demography in terms of the income, needs to be challenged, and needs to be this is where creativity, Indian creativity, needs to come in, and that will be the first foundational stone for Atmanirbhar Bharat to actually to happen. That's sort of with that. Let me just get into some details about the package, and then I'm happy to take questions. So as I had said when I talked about the COVID episode itself, it's primarily a demand side effect, with basically it having supply side ramifications, because of the lower demand can actually make put firms under stress. So and this is far more likely among the MSMEs. We, for instance, actually analyzed the data as well. When we look at the proportion of by basically the size of firms. Now let me concede here that it's not as if larger firms are not affected, but I'm talking about the relative impact. When you segregate the firms based on their size, and we've looked at the balance sheets, we basically have looked at stuff like interest coverage ratio, the liquidity ratios, etc. What we find is that MSMEs in this, in India, actually about 60% of them, are under stress. In contrast, large firms, when we do the same numbers, large firms, about 10 to 15% of them, would be in stress, while the MSME is about 60%. Now, go back to my argument about the bang for the buck. Therefore, it is important, because MSMEs also are important job creators, not to say that large firms are not important job creators, they are as well, but they're far better situation than the MSMEs. And so, given the need for targeting well, the package that the Honorable Finance Minister announced today for the MSMEs, I think is a very, very comprehensive one. Basically 6 steps. One is your about 3 lakh crores of credit, and it's 100% guaranteed up to an increase in the term loan / working capital limit of 20%, which is a good significant number. Just to give you why it is a good number, because a typical firm, let's say, turns its inventory, if you say about 4 or 5 times a year, then about a 25% increase, 20 to 25% increase. This adds to 10% that banks are themselves doing. So becomes 30%. They'll be able to tide over their inventory, and over their cash flow problems for at least a quarter, and maybe maybe beyond. That's why the increase in the term loan and working capital limits with 100% guarantee. Why are we giving the 100% guarantee? So that this does not suffer because the risk aversion of banks. That banks basically don't feel any risk at all, and they therefore on lend this the sub debt scheme for firms that are, now the first scheme, this basically credit is for firms that are not under stress. Those are actually those which are, which are not SMA or stressed. But then for stressed firms and firms that are in NPA, that there also there's been some relief that has been provided through the sub debt scheme. Then there is also the fund of funds for equity infusion into SMEs, because without equity, oftentimes debt, more debt only makes them, vulnerable, because at some point in time when they have to, repay. So that's the fund of funds, change in the definitions of the SME, of the MSMEs, SMEs, etc., so that they can actually size limits especially have been increased, and it's been made based on both both the investment and turnover, so that the perverse incentive that remains for firms to be small so that they can continue to enjoy these benefits, that perverse incentive is reduced significantly. This should enable growth of MSMEs further. And then there are a few other, one is basically on the dues that are due from government and PSUs to MSMEs to be cleared within 45 days, and the last bit is the on the global tenders, and enabling basically MSMEs to have a preferential treatment here. So I think this is a very comprehensive set of measures for the MSMEs, and we can talk about some of the other measures, but I think in the context of what I said, that MSMEs are really far more stressed, I think this is really important. Let me just end by saying that the 10% of GDP includes basically fiscal measures, includes liquidity, and includes the monetary measures as well. Now the good thing about this is that the components for the monetary and the liquidity part are far more than the fiscal one, because the fiscal one actually can create concerns, and I've actually spoken about this elsewhere as well. That the fiscal part is large, but but it's complemented by the liquidity and the monetary measures. And finally, one of the things that as Deng Xiaoping used to say, the Chinese premier, saying, I don't care about the color of the cat as long as it catches mice. So we don't have to necessarily make distinctions between the fiscal versus monetary versus liquidity, as long as they actually are able to enable firms to tide over their difficulties now. So I think together with the reform measures and bunch of reforms, actually, especially on you would have already been reading on labor, and on land. Labor, for instance, you have Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and Gujarat doing it. Land, Karnataka, for instance, in APMC, which is product market reforms, that a lot of states are doing, and these are, by the way, are very, very important. So in some sense, actually, we are in a 1991 kind of situation. There also we had responded with significant reforms, and here too we are actually doing really important reforms. I'll leave you with this with this thought, especially when you see some of the opposition that is voiced against these reforms, that when this government came back to power, a lot of people were saying, now, why isn't the government doing reforms? It has the majority to be able to, and it has come back with a majority, actually, why not do reforms? And now when reforms are being done, some people are basically also saying this is not the right time, etc. So if those of you who would who may have followed the events in 1991 will remember that when and it was P.V. Narasimha Rao who actually really instrumented these reforms, and if you remember, some of the people within his own party were also opposing it at that time, the likes of M.L. Photedar, Arjun Singh, Balram Jhakar, etc. And now you can look back and see whom do we remember? Do we remember those that basically grabbed the opportunity, historic opportunity to do the reforms, or those that were actually creating difficulties in implementing those reforms. And also keep in mind that when you think about these, and many of the people who are hearing may not even heard these names. I do remember, this was when I actually was getting interested in economics, and so I was following some of these events when I was in college at that time. So and the other last point to remember is some of these people actually don't necessarily strike you, those that were opposing, as reformers. In fact, these seem to be people who preferred status quo because they possibly benefited from it. So that's the last bit of comment on reforms and the political economy of reforms. I think I would end again by reminding you what I said at the outset, which is that first, don't get too pessimistic. Realize the human frailty, the bias that we tend to extrapolate both good times and bad times, far more than we should. If you are being a little bit more rational, then you'll actually realize, and this is not just me saying it, this is Nobel Prize winning research that says that we need to be far more rational in putting probability on what is beyond the current as well, which is and I spoke about the Spanish episode. So India will emerge much stronger out of this, especially because of the measures that are being taken now. And that only adds to what has what I've already spoken about, which is the fact that as they say, ye bhi badlega. This time will also change, and change in a good way.